Hi, I'm Rob Knight and welcome to Photography Basic Skills. Today is the second part of our discussion about the exposure triangle, specifically getting into the pieces of the exposure triangle. That is the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. I do have a video on the basics of exposure, sort of introducing you to the exposure triangle, so be sure and check that out if you need to catch up. And last week we talked about the ISO and how that affects our pictures. That basically determines how sensitive the sensor is to light, which is not exactly true, but in effect that's how the ISO works. So be sure and check out that video if you have any questions there. But today we're going to talk about the aperture. And I think in my work, the aperture tends to be one of the most important things and one of the first things that I set in the camera when I'm determining the exposure. And the reason the aperture is so important to me is that that's your main control of the depth of field. And depth of field means the amount of sharp focus in your image from front to back. For example, in this shot, I'm using a lens that is f1.8. And I'll explain what that means in a minute, but that means it has a wide open aperture. So with that wide open aperture, I can be in sharp focus in the video and my background is soft focused, right? So that helps me to stand out from the background. In something like a portrait or maybe wildlife and that kind of thing, you want your subject to be sharp and your background to be nice and soft focused so that your subject stands out. The opposite of that would be to stop down the aperture. That is to close down that aperture and use a smaller opening. And that gives you a greater depth of field. So for something like a landscape photograph where you want the foreground, the middle ground, and the background in sharp focus, then you're going to want to stop down your aperture. The aperture is actually a function of the lens on your camera. The aperture is a mechanical part of the lens. It's a series of metal blades that makes a hole through which the light comes in to strike the camera sensor. And you can adjust the size of that hole through either the dials on the top of your camera or some modern lenses, and especially old manual focus lenses have a ring on the lens itself that adjusts the size of that opening. And so that adjusts how much light comes in to your exposure. Right? So if you need to make your image brighter, you can open up the aperture. And if you need to make the image darker, you can close down the aperture. When we talk about aperture, we use the term f-stop. And the f-stop is simply the fraction of the focal length of the lens that relates to the size of the aperture opening. So a smaller f numbers, f2 for example, that's half of your focal length. So half of 25 millimeters in this case on this 25 millimeter lens. If I open this lens to f2, then I have an opening that's half of 25 millimeters. If I stop down the lens, if I make a smaller hole, it's going to be a larger f number because it's a fraction, right? So 1/2 is larger than 1/16, so that f2 is a bigger opening than f16. In practice, what you need to realize is that the lower the f number, the shallower your depth of field is going to be. The higher the f number, the more depth of field you're going to get, so the more of your image is going to be in sharp focus. The aperture setting is not the only thing that affects your depth of field, but it is the main thing. So in practice, I often set the aperture first. If I'm shooting something like wildlife or like a portrait, I'm going to use a wide open aperture, which is a smaller f number. Right? So the lens that I'm shooting with right now is an f1.8 lens. That means simply that the widest aperture I can use on this lens is f1.8. And you'll find these numbers on the front or somewhere marked on your lens. And you'll see 1:1.8, 1 being the focal length. So instead of saying f1.8, it says 1 to 1.8 because that's the fraction of that aperture. Different lenses, well, they might have a variable aperture. So you might have a lens that says 1 to 4 to 6.3. That means that lens, the maximum aperture changes as you go through the zoom range on that adjustable lens. A more expensive lens, the more professional lenses are generally going to have a constant maximum aperture, like the Olympus 12 to 100 millimeter f4 lens. You can open that lens to f4 no matter where you are in the zoom range between 12 millimeters and 100 millimeters. So that helps as a professional. That's good because if I set my exposure and I want to use f4, I don't have to change my exposure if I zoom out from 12 millimeters to 100 millimeters. So I told you aperture is the main thing that affects the depth of field, but I'm going to take you outside and show you through some photos how it's only one of the factors that controls depth of field. You've got your aperture setting, you've got your distance to the subject, and you've got the focal length of the lens. The closer you are to the subject, the shallower your depth of field is going to tend to be. Also, the longer the focal length of the lens, the less depth of field you're going to get just inherently. So that's why with a wide angle lens, it's easier to do those landscape shots where you have everything in focus. A wide angle lens is going to inherently have a greater depth of field, even at the same f-stops. So let's go outside and I'll walk you through some pictures and we'll see the difference. Okay, so I'm out here in the bird studio and I'm going to do a really simple demonstration. I've got my Olympus EM10 Mark IV here, and I've got a 25mm f1.8 lens on the camera. That means that with this lens, I can open up the aperture to a maximum size, to the lowest f number, to 1.8. So we're going to start with that, and I'm going to take a picture at sort of a normal range and show you what the depth of field looks like on that. Okay, so that's at f1.8. And I'm going to stop down the lens. That is to close the aperture, make the aperture smaller. I'm going to actually let less light into the camera. I'm shooting in aperture priority mode on the camera. So I'm choosing the aperture setting, and the camera is going to choose the shutter speed for me. And I've set the ISO to something that I think is appropriate for the light outside here. And one of the reasons that I shoot in aperture priority mode a lot of the time is, as you'll see as I'm shooting this video, the sun is kind of in and out of the clouds today. So if I'm shooting in full manual mode, then if I change the aperture setting, then I've got to adjust the shutter speed depending on what the light is doing. And a lot of the time I'm shooting outside, I'm shooting in different locations, I might be going from shade to sun. So for me, shooting in aperture priority mode allows me to choose the depth of field, and then the camera helps me by adjusting the shutter speed automatically. And I just keep an eye on what that shutter speed is. If I get down to half a second or a full second, I don't have enough light, then I need to make some adjustments. But that helps me to shoot more quickly and get a lot more keepers. So I'm going to stop down to f4. So I've gone from f1.8 to f4 now. And we'll see what the depth of field is for that. And you can see the depth of field is already starting to get a little more deep, so to speak, right? There's already more behind my subject that appears in sharper focus. I'm going to continue to go down, and remember, every click on the dial is a third of a stop. Aperture works just the same way that ISO does, that shutter speed does. So 3 clicks is 1 full stop. So I've gone from f4 to f5.6 in 3 clicks. That means I've let half as much light in, right? Because I've gone up 1 full stop. I'm going to stop down 1 more stop, 3 clicks to f8, and let's see what the depth of field is for that. Now we're starting to get quite a bit of detail in the background, and if I'm shooting a portrait, I'm not going to want that busy detail in the background. You want to really think about what you're shooting and how you want to depict that, and how you want to tell that story. And a lot of times the background can be very distracting, and that can ruin an otherwise really good shot. I'm going to continue to stop down. I'm going to go all the way to f16 and take a shot here. Now I've almost got full detail from the foreground into the background, even as close as I am to my subject. And I'm going to stop all the way down to f22 and see if that makes a big difference. So that's as much as I can stop down the lens, f22. So that is the most depth of field I can get with this lens combination with my subject this close. Now let me demonstrate how the distance to my subject is going to affect the depth of field. I'm going to open back up to about, let's say f2. Okay, and I'm going to take 1 shot at this distance. I'm very close. Okay, and my depth of field is very limited there. So now I'm going to take a step back. So now I've taken a step back, so I'm not as close to the subject, and let's see how that affects the depth of field, still shooting at f2. My subject is still in the same part of the frame. I get maybe a little more depth of field by being further back from my subject. I've traded my 25mm f1.8 lens for my 7 to 14mm f2.8 wide angle lens. So because the focal length of the lens affects the depth of field, we should have a lot more depth of field with this lens than we do with the 25mm f1.8 at the same settings. So I'm going to open up as much as I can. This is an f2.8 Pro lens, so I can open up to f2.8, and I'm at the same distance to my subject, and we'll see the difference in the depth of field between this wide angle and what's considered a normal focal length at that 25mm. So you can see it's a huge difference, right? A wide angle lens, even at f2.8, has a lot of depth of field. So if you're going to make that big landscape shot and you want everything in focus, using a wide angle lens and even stopping down to f5.6 or f8 gets you a whole lot of depth of field, and then you're sure to get everything in sharp focus. Okay, now I've switched to a combination that I don't use very often. This is the 300mm f4 Pro lens on the EM10 Mark IV. So it's a little bit unwieldy with the smaller camera body, but it's still going to make us a nice picture and help us with this demonstration. I'm at f4, so I mentioned this is a 300mm f4 lens. That means f4 is the fastest I can go with this lens. So I've had to move back across the yard to try to get a similar field of view to the 25mm and the 7mm lens. And let's see at f4 just how much depth of field we have or don't have with the telephoto lens. So it's pretty obvious that the long telephoto lens is going to compress things and give us less area of sharp focus from front to back in the picture. That's why with bird photography it becomes a little bit of a challenge. You might want to stop down. Even though you might be shooting in darker areas and you want as much light in the camera as you can, sometimes it's better to stop down just so you can maximize that depth of field, because I've got lots of shots where maybe the bird's beak is in focus and his eye is out of focus, and we're talking about, you know, fractions of an inch. So that's something to keep in mind when you're choosing your lens, when you're choosing your aperture setting, when you need more or less light. Keep in mind what that lens and the focal length is going to do to your picture as well. Hopefully you're starting to get the hang of the exposure triangle. We've talked about how the exposure triangle works. We've talked about the ISO and how it controls the brightness of the image, but it might add a little grain. And now we've talked about the aperture setting and how the wider or narrower aperture makes your image darker or brighter, and also how that controls depth of field. So now we're getting into some things that you can use creatively as far as, you know, the depth of field. If you want a shallow depth of field or a greater depth of field, now you know how to use your aperture setting in order to get the look that you want in your pictures, because really that's what it's all about. It's about making the image that you want to make. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned next time for shutter speed. That's going to be the third point in the exposure triangle, and we'll have a nice simple explanation of that and show you how that affects how motion is depicted in your pictures. Check out the other photography basic skills videos on this playlist, and please drop me a comment or send me an email at rob@robknightphotography.com and let me know if there's a tutorial that you want to see. Are there any things that you want tips about, even little small things? I know sometimes those little details can make the difference in understanding what's going on with your photography and feeling like you're a little lost. So let me know if there's anything I can help you with. Just drop me a line, and stay tuned. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.